I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Study war no more. Sing it with me, brother. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Study war no more. Study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Yeah.
And we're back on Take Action News. So picture this. You were listening to Pete Seeger with Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. Picture this. You're 14 years old. You love music. You want to learn the guitar and other instruments. You live in the New York City area, and on a local radio station, I think it was a New Jersey station, there's a black and white TV show called Rainbow Quest, where Pete Seeger, who's a folk singer, and you admire him as a lefty, you admire him as a folk singer, but he is your parents' age, remember, let's not forget that. Pete comes on with this TV show every week, and he has people like legends, people who, I mean, they could be out of the Tales of King Arthur as far as you're concerned, like Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, coming on the show and sitting down with him and talking. That was the experience I had growing up in New York City, where Pete Seeger was both a hero and a challenge for guys like me. He was a hero because he was Pete Seeger. He was a challenge because it was the days of rock and roll and revolution. And, you know, rock and roll and revolution were not things that tied together all that nicely with people of your parents' age. So, you know, I wrote a piece about Pete, who, as most of you know, or all of you know, passed away this week at the age of 94. I loved him. I didn't know. I encountered him, but I didn't know him. Pete was an extraordinary human being, but I struggled, you know, young. How could I rebel when the music was being played by such a wholesome, happy, cheerful individual? If there had been goths when I was 14, I would have been a goth. How can you reconcile that with a guy like Pete Seeger? And I'll tell you, here's how. Because Pete was so relentlessly optimistic, so relentlessly positive, so relentlessly fair and just and humane that he was a force that couldn't be denied. I wrote a piece where I interviewed my friend Happy Traum. Now, Happy goes all the way back in the folk music movement to, he says he met Pete in 1956 when Happy himself was in high school, and that Pete was generous and open and kind to him then. And Happy told me a couple things that really opened my eyes. And by the way, Happy himself is a legend. You can find his work and his publishing on homespun.com. But Happy, for example, played on the first recording of Blowin' in the Wind, which was done for Sing Out or one of those magazines with Bob Dylan in 1962. He was there. And he said, among other things, he published Pete's instructional book and so on. He said that Pete was an educator as much as he was a performer. And it's true. Pete wanted to teach with everything he did, whether it was creating a demonstration, whether it was sailing a boat up and down the Hudson River to illustrate the fact that that river needed to be clean, and stopping in all the towns along the way to sing and have concerts. He stopped in Nyack, near where I lived, and we all came out and we helped out with the setup and so on. He was an educator. He was a musician, a superb musician, a superb popularizer of music, a superb songwriter. If I Had a Hammer and Where Have All the Flowers Gone and all those immortal songs. And, you know, when I became more of a musician myself, I still had this sense of embarrassment. If I Had a Hammer, Where Have All the Flowers Gone, they're so wholesome, they're so well-intentioned. I wanted to be edgy, but I'll tell you when my feelings about If I Had a Hammer changed. I'm sorry, about Where Have All the Flowers Gone. It changed, first of all, when I was playing some music for some Vietnamese refugees who didn't have a place to stay and didn't know English very well. But that was one song they knew and one song they wanted to hear. And I'll tell you, to sing that song to that audience makes you realize the timelessness and the power and the beauty of the music that, you know, sometimes we reject our legacy because it embarrasses us when we're young, and we embrace it with maturity. The other time I sang it, by the way, was just a few years ago. I think they're the only two times I've sung it. Maybe about 5 years ago, I performed at a political fundraiser in Santa Barbara, California. I was the opening act for General Wesley Clark. And so I got on with my guitar, and usually I like to have a band with me because Bob Dylan said, you know, one man with a guitar entertaining a crowd is like one person taking on an army. Well, I'm not usually that brave, but I did it in this case. And General Clark asked me to sing that song as well. So I did, and then he came up and gave an impromptu 20-minute speech that was basically based on Pete's song. So a man who spends his life perfecting the art of war can also understand the call to peace. And in fact, General Clark told me afterwards that he used to go hear Peter, Paul, and Mary sing that when he was a student at West Point. So, you know, the University of Music can't be denied. And that was what Pete Seeger was all about. As Happy also told me, he said even singing a lullaby for Pete Seeger was a political act. And what he meant by that was that it was organizing an audience for the music. It was creating the singers and folk musicians and folk music lovers of the future. It was creating a base for the values that this kind of music represented at its best moments. And that was Pete Seeger's mission. That was his life. That was his accomplishment. And if you can touch Vietnamese refugees and a five-star general and all the people in between when you're doing it, you've accomplished something wonderful. Pete was also a wonderful archivist of music. You know, he brought together, for example, the poems of the Cuban revolutionary hero Jose Marti, and revolutionary going back more than 100 years, with a popular Cuban hit song of the late 1920s called Guantanamera, which means woman of Guantanamo, ironically enough, and made a hit out of that. And I'll close with this. So when I was about 21, I was traveling through Mexico with a guitar and a friend, but the friend disappeared, so I was walking around with a guitar, and some kids gestured for me to follow them. I climbed up a hillside. There was a church at the top. The sun was setting, long shadows on the cobblestones, and from the church I heard a choir of children singing Pete Seeger's version of Guantanamera. So, you know, Happy Traum said to me, well, I guess Pete's job is over after we learned that Pete died. But, you know, if you're a folk singer, your job is never over.